he felt more accountable to us, to our growth, to our development, to us as human beings. That came first before the accountability to the numbers. As we are holding other people accountable for things, I think it's really valuable to think about, okay, what am I accountable to?
Accountability is a common word in the language of leadership. But how often do we talk about leaders being accountable to those they lead? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from David Mead. David is an experienced entrepreneur, author, and speaker. And when I say experienced, I mean it. In his career, David has spoken to live audiences on 5 continents, in 21 countries, and to a total of more than 160,000 people. He's also co-authored a book that has sold more than 500,000 copies and been translated into 25 languages. And on top of all of that, David is a strategic partner with our company, The Aperio, where he helps leaders grow and develop in practical and profound ways. During our discussion, you'll get a chance to hear about David's perspective on the concerns some leaders have about empathizing with those they lead. You'll hear about the concept of mutual accountability in leadership, and you'll even get to hear a little bit about how David ended up co-authoring his book with the one and only Simon Sinek. But first, we get to go deep with David about his early influences and how the manager of his very first job working part-time at a bagel shop continues to influence how he leads and advises leaders today.
So a couple things come to mind. A couple people and a couple of situations related to those people. The first would be my mom and just the way I was raised, which I was definitely the weird kid, my siblings and I all. But the thing that I really got from my mom was just a sense of discipline and responsibility, I think was the big thing. A service mindset was really heavily ingrained into me as a kid. And so, we did a lot of service projects. We, helped a lot of refugees. It just seemed like that was a constant part of life, is how do we reach out and help other people? And I think that played a lot into developing my character and, has come up over and over and over again for me in my later life. So my mom was a huge influence for me that way. The second one was when I was 17 years old, one of my very first jobs, I worked at a bagel shop. I wasn't even conscious of it at the time, obviously, because at 17 years old, you don't really think about this stuff. But as I looked back on it several years later, especially after I got into this field of, leadership and culture, I realized how pivotal that experience was for me in terms of the guy who ran the shop. We'll call him Brad just to spare his identity, just because he's the kind of person who wants zero recognition for anything that he's done.
So this eliminates all Brads in the world then. If you know a Brad, it's not him.
It's not him.
So there we go.
So, it was this part-time job, right? And, like minimum wage, not super exciting. Had to drive 30 minutes from my house to get there. But for all intents and purposes, not the job you'd think I would remember. But the type of environment that Brad created at this place, it would have been very easy for him. We're all mostly teenage kids, early 20s, that kind of stuff. Would have been very easy for him to just sort of tell us what to do. But one of the things that he really did was just sort of leave us to ourselves. That said, if we were slammed, he would be the first one to put on an apron and come and help. But otherwise, if we had a question, if we weren't sure how to handle a situation, whatever, he would let us figure it out. He's that kind of leader, right? And, completely unassuming, again, not the kind of person who wants any kind of recognition for anything that he's done. He would have us over to his house, every 6 months or so, just to hang out, get to know each other. But just the environment that he created was one that I will always remember, and one that has really shaped the way that I approach leadership and the concepts that I talk about.
I get a chance to talk with leaders, and from time to time, this issue of, hey, back in my first leadership position, my boss told me that I shouldn't be friends with the people that I lead. My boss told me that I shouldn't hang out with them. And yet here you are talking about, and we intentionally spent time together outside of work. What's your perspective on this idea of kind of creating space? Because I find that even with people who are very senior in large organizations, somebody 25 years ago told them this and they're wrestling with it today. What are your thoughts?
I think there is value in boundaries for sure. It's not that I think a leader necessarily needs to have people spending the weekends at their home. Even this guy, Brad, he was approachable. And at the same time, we knew that he still had his boundaries, right? And so I think it's finding that balance, and it's going to be different for everybody. But it's this idea of how do you balance being human and being approachable and loving people for who they are, and also not letting it get to the point where that gets in the way of you holding them accountable for things or going after the results that you need, because those are important things as well. And I think that's really what the wrestle is. In my own experience, what I've seen from leaders is they have a real problem balancing accountability with empathy. So it's like, how can I be empathetic to my people? How can I, show that emotion toward them or care about them and also hold them accountable at the same time? It feels like those two things are diametrically opposed, and they're not. When we build trust, when we build connection with people, when we have that deeper relationship, it's actually easier to hold them accountable. Brad was fierce about holding us accountable to stuff. But when he held us accountable for stuff, we knew it was because of that bigger picture that he had in mind. He genuinely believed that we all had greatness inside of us. And as stupid as that sounds for a part-time bagel shop job, that's just the kind of guy he was. But when he came down on us for something, we knew it was because he genuinely cared about us doing the best job that we could do, presenting the product that we had the best that we could. It wasn't that he was coming down on us. It was that he had standards and he was simply holding us accountable to those standards. And because we respected him, it didn't feel like we were getting in trouble. It felt like he was helping us grow. It felt like he was teaching us. And maybe I didn't realize that in the moment as a 17-year-old, but now looking back on it and having, had more experience with him later in my early 20s, that comes through.
I think we're going to create a new term here on the podcast, and the term is going to be part-time bagel shop. And anytime somebody says part-time bagel shop, that means exceptional leadership.
I used to ask a lot of audiences when I would give a talk to think of the best job they'd ever had. Almost never was it the current job they were in, right? It was always, I was a lifeguard. I was a counselor at a youth camp. I was a bartender. I was like all these mundane jobs that definitely were not making them the most money they've ever made. It was not a position where they had a great position of leadership or perks or all this kind of stuff. It was usually an environment where they had a great leader and or where they had the opportunity to feel like they were part of something, where they felt like they belonged, where they felt like they were making a difference. A lot of that stuff comes down from leadership.
What you're talking about is essentially when and where and how are we tapping into some of the most basic needs that we have as human beings. And when we get an opportunity to fulfill those, then that's satisfying work to do. When I get a chance to make a difference, when I'm seen, when I'm valued. Is it important to make money? Yeah. But it's pretty rare that that's going to be the answer of what's the best job you've ever had. And you have that experience. I can't let Brad go yet. I got one more question. When you say that he left you alone, the vibe I get from it as I hear you tell the story is developmentally, he created space for you. Yet at the same time, you're telling stories about how he held the line. And in other stories, you're talking about how he jumped in on the line and fixed food and did whatever needed to do. So as we're thinking about the folks listening to our conversation today, somebody might say, wait a second, you just sit there on your microphones and talk out of both sides of your mouth at the same time. And you say A in one instance and B in the other. But what do I do? Whether it's in the executive suite or a little bit further into the organization, should I leave people to their own devices because that's like throwing them in the deep end of the pool and they'll learn to swim, hopefully? Or is it, toe the line on wash your hands 27 times. So as you look back at that experience from Brad, how would you articulate the way Brad walked that line that felt developmental and empowering in one hand, but also he held the standards as well? What's that balance beam that you got to be on to do that well?
First is he was very clear on expectations. So the training was good. The bar was there and we all knew what it was. So that, I think, allowed him an opportunity to sort of more sit back and observe. And if he noticed something that wasn't being done to the standard, rather than coming in and nitpicking about the thing, it was, what's my responsibility? Where did I miscommunicate or where did the message not get across as to what this standard is? And how can I do better in, teaching the people that come along later on to meet that standard? He would often walk through and he would just sort of observe and see. And when we saw him coming, that was sort of a reminder of, oh, okay, are we doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, right? So to bring all that sort of into simple terms, I think setting clear expectations at the beginning and knowing what we were supposed to do allowed him to give us the space. And then when he noticed that something was not being done to the standard, then he would address it, but also take responsibility for where he might have fallen short in us not getting to that standard.
As I listen to you unpack that, it really unpacks something else for me in my mind as I hear it, which is to say, okay, he was really clear about the expectations. But if we go back earlier in your comments, two other things he did even before he clarified expectations, which was he looked for his contribution. What did I not communicate well? Which is very different than, you idiot, why aren't you doing it correctly? Those are two wildly different worldviews and perspective. What did I communicate not as well as I could have or should have? And the thing going back even further in your story is he cared about me. So if I start with caring about people, like for real, if I actually care about them and I begin with my contribution first, how could I have done this better? Then going on to expectations and accountability, I think it feels totally different to be on the other side of that kind of leader than the leader who begins with hardcore accountability. When I empathize, when I connect with, I actually have a more open door on the accountability side. And I have had other leaders that we have worked with as an organization say that exact same thing. They're all concerned. They do a concerted effort to be more empathic, and they find the doorways to accountability are wider open, not more narrow. And so it all begins with who Brad is as a person in terms of showing up as a caring person who owns his contributions first. Then it goes in to clear expectations. Then it goes into accountability.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you put accountability sort of at the end, which is the right place to put it. And if you look at the opposite end of that, which is what did Brad feel he was accountable for? He felt more accountable to us, to our growth, to our development, to us as human beings. That came first before the accountability to the numbers. As we are holding other people accountable for things, I think it's really valuable to think about, okay, what am I accountable to? Because if I go in with a mindset of I'm accountable to a number or a shareholder or a metric, then the way I hold people accountable is going to be to a number or a metric or a shareholder. If people feel like my accountability is to them and to their growth and their development and their fulfillment as a human being, then chances are their performance is going to improve, and then those other accountabilities are going to naturally be met.
What's really beautiful about that equation is you're talking about kind of circular accountability. We're accountable to one another. I'm accountable to do my job as a leader, which means we need to learn and point out things and grow and develop and get better and drive the numbers and all of those things. But I'm accountable to you to clearly communicate, to have your best interests at heart, to find those places where I can just stay upstairs, maybe peek out the window once in a while so that you guys can figure it out. It's odd to call that accountability, but it is, because I'm creating space for you to grow and develop instead of standing right beside you and say, okay, now take the tomato and put it on the bagel sandwich. Okay, now wait, and that, no, different angle. Like we could do that. But I love the idea of mutual accountability. The idea that, yes, the people we're leading are accountable to us to play their roles and to do them well. Mm-hmm. And we could even say this to them. I have an accountability to you. I have an accountability to, show up and not just talk about good things, but do them. I have an accountability to create space for you to grow and develop. That's really a wholesome interaction that creates a lot of great things. Now that we've kind of started with your history, jump forward to some ideas around leadership. I want to go backwards a little bit again and talk about kind of what happened in your career and your life. What led you to be passionate about leadership and eventually be in the space where you coach, consult, advise, and talk about leadership as you do today? What was the transition point from bagels and then a server, and then how did you end up getting into this work?
It's a bit of a windy road. So I graduated, I did my undergrad, I had like 5 majors, and I finally just decided to graduate in communications so I could get out of there. I bounced around, from sales job to sales job because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. My dad had, as I was growing up, had been a consultant, not in leadership necessarily, but, he did trainings and workshops and consulting and stuff, traveled all over the world. And I thought, gosh, that might be fun. I ended up as a sales trainer, doing, new hires trainings for a Yellow Pages company back when phone books were a thing. Did that for a couple of years and really kind of right there got a taste for not necessarily leadership, but the ability to share information with people that was helpful, that could help them improve their situation, that could help them be a little better than they were the day before. What was missing for me in that is that, as with a lot of sales jobs, turnover was really, really high. And these were 2-week-long trainings. I would spend 2 weeks with these people. And then they'd stick around for 3-4 months, and usually would be gone off to something else. And so it was sort of like that, I never really got to see the results of the training that I gave. I quit to do kind of an entrepreneurial thing that landed me at the bottom of the barrel in 2008. Ended up losing everything, had to file bankruptcy, and ended up in my dad's basement, pregnant with our first child, and had just having started MBA school. I could not get a job to save my life because of that communications degree. So I ended up working retail at Apple, just at the mall, part-time again, and I loved it. Amazing people, amazing culture. And I really wanted to go the corporate route and, get up into the training space at Apple, but nobody quit. And so I could never move up. And so after about, 9 or 10 months of that, I was like, okay, this isn't working. As much as I love it, I don't have the time to wait. So I was walking into the back room to clock out after my shift. And I just sort of, under my breath, said to myself, gosh, I got to find another job. And a buddy of mine overheard me and he said, hey, my best friend just started this sales company, summer sales, and you can make, 70, 80 grand in a summer if you want to do that. And I was like, that sounds like the last thing I want to do, actually. But, 70, 80 grand in, 3 months sounds pretty good. So I'll go talk to him. So I went and talked to this guy and he heard a little bit about my background, that I was doing an MBA. And he's like, you know what, we actually need a director of training. So would you be interested in doing that instead? I was like, yes, please. Because, sales is just not my thing. It's just, I'm not made for that. I had been there about a week and they said, hey, we're having, this offsite team building thing. We're having a speaker come in. Do you want to come? I showed up and some guy named Simon Sinek walks in. Nobody had any clue who Simon Sinek was. He had no book. He had no TED Talk at the time. And he's talked to 20 people in this little startup in Salt Lake City about his little concept called the Golden Circle. As I listened to him talk, I was like, yeah, I know that already. But nobody had ever articulated it or put it into a model that made so much sense. And so all of a sudden I had this realization of like, oh, that's why there are certain jobs that I've loved and thrived in and certain jobs that I haven't, even though looking from the outside in, you would think that the job would be great or the job would be horrible or whatever, but it was the opposite because of this, right? I took his little idea, I stole it, and I wrote it down into the training stuff that I was writing as the training director for this little company. Simon came back and worked with us 2 or 3 times, and I gave him a copy of the manual that I had written. I gave it to him just to show him what he had inspired. I didn't expect him to read it. But the gal that was working with him at the time, Kim, she did read it. And a couple months later, she called me and she was like, you only heard him speak once, right? And she was like, well, we're both pretty dang surprised that you could hear him speak one time and actually take his ideas and turn it into something like this. We're putting together an online course. Do you want to come and help? And so I said, sure, I'd be happy to. They were on Eastern time and I was on Mountain time. So I would get up and work with them a couple hours in the morning before I would go to this full-time job at this sales company, right? Trying to incorporate all this stuff I was learning into my full-time job. That's really kind of when the spark of, oh, this makes a huge difference in culture and how leadership works and how, leaders make a difference in the lives of the people that they lead and how they can create a completely different experience of what work is and all this stuff. And so I was trying to pepper all this stuff into the work that I was doing with this sales company. And after the course was done, they kept me on because by this time his TED Talk had come out, the first book had come out, Start With Why. And so, people were kind of starting to get to know who he was. The emails were rolling in. And so now I was answering email. After a couple of years, the sales company that I was working for, they didn't really get it. They decided they didn't want to keep paying me to do what I was trying to do culture-wise. And so they let me go. And so I called Simon. I was like, hey, I got a little more spare time. You got anything else for me to do? At that time, he couldn't really afford it, but he brought me on full time. And that's when I, really started to dive into the leadership and culture.
That's a really interesting road. To me, one of the things, knowing a little bit more about your story and where it has gone from there, the idea that you're getting up for a couple of hours talking, how do we articulate theory in such a way that it's actionable? Then driving to work and applying it, that's what a laboratory. I mean, that is incredible to be, I'm going to have this conversation from, 5 to 7 a.m. or whatever time it was. And then I'm going to eat breakfast and then I'm going to go give it a go here this afternoon. That's just, you can't orchestrate things like that.
I remember going out into the parking lot of that, of that company and calling Simon and Kim and being like, hey, this is what's going on. What do we do? Trying to figure out how do I help this company overcome these issues that they're having.
And then Simon gave an answer with his accent, which made it a 20% better answer. Even if he said the exact same words, it just becomes smarter and better because of his accent. So there you are. Now you're full time. And of course, there'll be many people listening who are well acquainted with Simon's work at this point, but really interesting to be visiting with somebody who was there nearly from the very beginning. You go on to end up authoring the book Find Your Why alongside Simon. I imagine there's some people that are like, wow, that's got to be a unique experience. Here's somebody who is a pretty known entity. What is it like to saddle up next to that person? Now, all of us involved in this podcast, we know a little bit more of the story. We know that you knew Simon well before, and so you kind of eased into it into a sense. But talk to us a little bit about the experience of co-authoring alongside somebody who's got such global recognition and followership.
There were so many things I didn't know that I didn't know, right? And there were three of us. There was me, there was Simon, there was Peter Docker, who was three co-authors of this book. And the way that came about, the reason it was the three of us was, it was obviously Simon's content and initial idea. And Peter and I, for a handful of years before we started writing the book, the intent was, okay, how do we take kind of the rabbit out of the hat magic trick that Simon was so good at doing with people, of helping them discover and articulate their why? How do we do that without him in the room? And so what's a process that anybody could follow to get to the same result without relying on one human being who, if he gets hit by a bus, then the world doesn't get this thing. And we finally came up with a process that, that's what Find Your Why is essentially the workshop that we would take people through, both individuals and organizations, to articulate their why. So that was the whole purpose of it. The process itself took, I think it was about 2.5 years. And we had huge challenges in the fact that I was in Salt Lake City, Simon was in New York, Peter was in the UK. So, just time zones alone and locations, I don't think we were ever all three in a room together working on it. I flew to New York once or twice, to be with Simon directly, and we would have Peter on Skype at the time. Zoom wasn't a thing. The process was essentially Peter and I did the initial draft just based on, the flow of the workshop. And then Simon came through and, made edits and tweaks and put it in his voice so that it would match the other books that he had written and sound, in his language and his voice. That's the very short version. And then, it was just sort of this whirlwind of, I think when it came out, if I'm not mistaken, it was number 38 on leadership books on Amazon. To date, as of April 2023, we've sold, I think, 523,000 copies. It's translated into at least 25 languages that we know of. So it's just had incredible success and just helped so many people, which has been great.
500,000 copies, 25 languages. What does it feel like to have contributed to something that's had that far of a reach?
I mean, incredible. And, I'm under no illusion that it would have done anywhere near that well if it didn't have Simon's name on it, obviously. It feels great.
You mentioned the word entrepreneur earlier, and so it comes back up again. End of 2019, you decide that you're going to launch off on your own, and let's all just recognize what a wonderful time in the world December of 2019 would be to launch a new business. I mean, unless you were in the business of PPE and toilet paper, it was not a good time to launch a new business. Yet, here you are. So talk to us a little about the leadership development work you're passionate about doing today.
I have never considered myself an entrepreneur, just because to me, entrepreneurs are the ones who have these big visions, these grand ideas, and they go on and, they build these big companies and sell them and do it again. And that's not me. I will say that I'm a solopreneur and I work for myself. That feels a little better. When I left, I knew things would slow down. I mean, to give some perspective, I was on a plane to some part of the world every week, giving a talk or a workshop. Opportunities were just falling in my lap. And then in March of 2020, I wasn't quite ready for things to just completely fall through the bottom of the floor. I have to say, for the first, 6 to 9 months, I was in complete denial. I was like, oh, it's fine. Like, I need to come up with new content. Now I'm talking about my own stuff. So, I got time and we'll just wait it out. We'll be back by fall. I was in this place that felt really strange, where as bought into and as committed as I was to Simon's content, and it was this weird feeling of, I can talk about whatever I want. So what I did is I went back to the experiences that I had had. I thought about all the experiences I had of being led by really incredible, amazing leaders that I would follow again, and also experiences that I had of leaders that were on the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
They shape us as well, don't they?
They do. You learn just as much, if not more, from them about what not to do and who not to be, as from the great ones. So as I thought about that, I thought, okay, so what did those leaders create for me? What did the great leaders create, and what was missing or lacking in the leaders that were not so great? That's where I really kind of focused on this idea of building trust and human connection. Because for me, that's what the greatest leaders that I've ever followed have engendered, is trust and connection. And that leads to all kinds of things like, performance and transparent communication and innovation and well-being and all those things that every company I know of is trying to increase. And so I thought, if those are the end goals for every organization, then how do we affect or change leaders and how leaders show up so that those goals become natural outcomes rather than things that we're just trying to push against for their own sake?
So here you are, a number of years into that, and you've gotten a chance to, even with the slowdown, gotten a chance to be involved in important conversations around leadership. So it's kind of a dual question about kind of what is most exciting or encouraging about what you're engaged in dialogue with people from a leadership standpoint. And then the other side, what scares you or bothers you or gives you concern that you're seeing from a trend standpoint.
The thing that I have noticed, especially through COVID and through some of the, the other issues that we've had specifically in this country with, social issues and political issues and that kind of thing. The thing that concerns me is that leaders will say things, or that their organizations will take a certain position on things based on what's popular, based on what they're told they should do, and everybody does the same thing just because that's what we're supposed to do. That bothers me. Why are we not looking at the things that matter to us? Why are we standing for things that we're being told to stand for rather than things that we actually do stand for? Which may match the things that we're being told to stand for, or they may not. But when everybody is expected to do the same thing, that just, I don't know, that doesn't feel right to me.
Well, when you begin to suck genuineness and authenticity out of leadership, it becomes a pretty hollow activity. And people may put up with it, but they're not going to give their heart and soul to it. They might leverage it for a time being, but it's certainly not going to produce the kind of engagement and ultimately performance and results that are possible when we're simply kind of going along with that leader who doesn't, for our experience, appear to be all that genuine, all that authentic, just repeating lines and towing what the organization might tell them to say one way or the other. That's never been the leader that we would run through a wall for.
Right. It's not that the issues that they're taking a position on shouldn't be addressed and, that there's not some validity to those, but it's just when the pendulum swings so far to one side that it negates anything else other than that, and our perspective is completely one-sided, That's where the issue for me is.
So what about on the other side then? Something that's encouraging or that excites you about what you see going on with leadership?
I remember the very, very first, it was 2011. It was our first offsite with Simon. He had a gig in Paris. And so Kim and I flew out to Paris to meet him. And we had our own first little, 3-person offsite there to kind of plan what in the world we were going to do with this thing. And I remember him saying, one of the ways that we'll know we've been successful is when the term why becomes part of the standard vernacular, that people are just using it. I saw that happen, which was pretty cool, right? What encourages me is that over these last, several years, the idea of purpose and meaning and fulfillment at work have become less weird and more mainstream, and people are recognizing how important that is, not only for the people within the organization, but for leaders and how leaders show up to lead their organizations. So that's super exciting to me. And more specifically now, over the last 3.5 years or so that I've been speaking about trust and human connection, how, again, this idea of authenticity and bringing humanness back to work, it's very similar to what I saw with this concept of purpose. The people are recognizing now that it doesn't help anybody to walk around with this facade or this wall that I have all the answers, everything's okay, I know exactly what I'm doing, I don't need any help, but that we can break those walls down, we can be genuine with each other, we can ask for help, we can offer when we see somebody who's struggling, we can have a difficult conversation. Emotional health and mental health is becoming a real hot point in every organization, and people are recognizing everybody has something going on, and it's our responsibility to make sure that people are individually taken care of. This idea of we're all human, we're all dealing with something is becoming very, very top of mind, and it's so important.
It opens up pathways to deeper trust and human connection that you're aiming at when we acknowledge kind of the fullness of the people that we're leading and the fullness of who we are as leaders in the midst of all of the challenges that come up. You said you don't think of yourself as an entrepreneur, and yet you're doing some very entrepreneurial things. So there's speaking and coaching and consulting in the leadership space, but you've got other stuff going on as well. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting how times change. I was over the weekend, I was actually reflecting on how my perspective has changed over the last several years, where I used to thrive on stability and security and knowing where my next paycheck was coming from. And it was very, very frightening to me to not have that. And now, 14 years or so later, it actually excites me and energizes me to not know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I've gotten used to it. And so it's been a really, really interesting shift. So, but the last 3.5 years as a speaker has been tough. And so, I've been getting work and, it's been fine, but it certainly has not been to the level that I am used to or that I want it to be. I can always do more. And so on top of the opportunities that I am getting with speaking and workshops and partnering with great people like you, I have taken this different route, and I'm focusing on something a little bit different, where I'm taking all of this knowledge, this experience that I've gained over the last 14 years, and I'm shifting my focus a bit to building leaders of my own within an organization called doTERRA. It's a network marketing company, which if you had told me 6 months ago I would be doing this, I would have told you were nuts. Pretty sure everybody who starts in on network marketing was very skeptical at the beginning, and that was absolutely me. I've caught a vision of being able to provide an opportunity and an environment for people who have not received the type of leadership that they need in order to thrive. People who have been in environments where their leaders don't care about them, don't listen to them, are not empathetic toward their situation or what they need to grow. And so I'm able to now take all of this content that I have learned and this experience that I have and point it in this direction to help other people who want to build their own business and create an environment where they can get this coaching, they can get this content, this information to be able to do the thing that lifts them up, that fires them up, that brings them fulfillment and meaning, and to be a real tangible part of helping them to build and grow their business within doTERRA. And that's really, really exciting to me.
Well, it's exciting to me to hear it too, because that space is filled with people who are just trying to make a buck. That is the norm. That is what that industry is known for. So the idea that you would enter into that network marketing space with a completely different perspective of investing in and supporting these leaders to grow and develop their own businesses and to do it in a human-centric way, as opposed to, let me just see how many people I can get in my downline so I can kind of just cause the cash register to go up. It's a totally different perspective. And so to me, you get to stand out in an industry that does not have enough of what you have to bring. So I'm excited that you're stepping into that space, because to me, it's going to be blue ocean for a leader like you to get in there and do that. And that's really exciting.
To be clear about it as well, I'm very intentional about doing it with doTERRA, because doTERRA, obviously not a perfect company, no company is. But what I have seen so far, they are the type of company I've been talking about for the last 14 years. The way they treat their corporate employees, the way they treat their suppliers, the way they treat their distributors, the way the principles and the values that they had from the very beginning that are still alive and well today, 15 years later, that is what draws me to them, right? It's not like I'm going into some, shark pit trying to change the industry. I am going into an organization that already largely operates this way. And so it's a perfect fit and a perfect sort of platform for me to do the work that I do, because it fits so naturally into how they already operate.
I'm so thankful for us to have had the opportunity to visit with my colleague and friend, David Mead. There are a couple of things that David shared that I want to reiterate as we wrap up this episode. The first one is the discussion that we had around empathy and accountability. We have run into the same thing that David was sharing, where we have talked with leaders and organizations that are concerned about empathy. There's a concern that if we empathize with those we are leading, that we will not be able to hold them accountable to performance and results. And as David shared, and I would reiterate with you here, we have found just the opposite to be true. We have found that when leaders are in relationship with those they are leading, even at an emotional level, that connection makes for a better pathway to accountability conversations. So my encouragement to all of us as we think about this is to lean into empathy, to not assume that it's going to make accountability more difficult, and to even anticipate that it's going to make accountability healthy and effective. There are lots of ways to do accountability that are not healthy, and ultimately then in the long run ineffective. But to apply empathy to our leadership is to also bring a really effective element that helps us do accountability in a much healthier and effective way over the long haul. The second thing that I want to emphasize is this idea of mutual accountability. David talked about not just having followers be accountable to leaders, not just having the people who worked in the bagel shop be accountable to Brad, the bagel shop manager, but that he had an accountability and a responsibility to them as well. One that he would articulate, one that he needed to say and do. So this idea that in leadership, it's not just accountability to the leader or to the expected result, to the expected performance, but that the leader has an accountability to the followers, to develop them, to invest in them, to care for them, to help them have all of the training and development and thinking that they need, that they get all of the resources that are necessary for them to succeed, including the deep support that they would want to have from the person they're following. So this concept of mutual accountability, I think, is a brilliant one and an important one. And so that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today. And that is this. As a leader, are you making yourself accountable to the people that you are leading? I'm Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.